morning. I'm Tim. I'm the associate pastor here at Bethel, and I'm excited that you're here. If you're visiting with us this morning, then I hope that you've already felt welcome as you've come, but that you enjoy yourself this morning. And if you would all, just as you go through this morning, that communication card that Pastor Jerry mentioned, if you would just consider as you're listening, as we've sung and celebrated, and you hear what through God's word, just whatever is on your heart, on your mind, if you would put that on the back of that card, on that communication card, and then when we receive the morning's offering, we'll pass a basket. And if you would just put that that card in the basket, share your thoughts with us, your concerns, your prayer requests, what you're thinking, questions you might have. And put them on that card in the basket, and that helps us out a lot. And so we'll be doing that after the message. We'll pass those baskets. And if you're visiting with us today, that's all we're going to ask for you to give. That's all we're going to ask for you to put in that basket. We just want to be able to connect with you, get to know you, and it's a great way for us to do that. For our members, it's a great way for us to keep communication with you and understanding where you're at and what's going on and how your lives are developing and where your concerns are, where your heart is at. And so please use those cards this morning as we just work through this service and work through celebrating God and celebrating what He has made, as we just work through His Word. So today we are going to start a new series that each kind of week is going to stand by itself, but they connect to each other in just the spirit and nature of what we're doing. And so this series is called Stories. We're going to be looking at different Bible stories throughout the summer. And kind of some of us may have, we might not have heard these stories for a long time. We might have been a kid the last time we heard the story. And so I thought it would be fun to go back and look at them. And as I said last time, I don't have, maybe you're missing the flannel graph. I don't have the flannel graph to put all the different characters up there for you. But so I apologize if you were looking forward to that. We're not gonna have that. But we do have cute kids. So there is that. I love asking my boys. I have two boys. Titus is 5, Carter's 3. And I love asking the boys what they learned today in church. And I don't really necessarily think, if you've ever asked like a 4-year-old what they learn in church, it should never be an indictment of their teacher. It's not the teacher, right? Because who knows what they grab onto certain details, right? And they miss other details. And it's kind of, sometimes it's an exercise in futility to say, well, what did you learn today, right? Because all they learned was that there's 4 different kinds of animal crackers that they ate, and they ate the heads off of all of them first. Because who doesn't eat the head off of the animal cracker first? I mean, that just makes sense. So I usually ask them, what did you learn? I'll ask them this morning after church. I'll say, what did you learn in class today? And you never know what they'll remember or what they'll tell you. Last week I asked Carter, he's the 3-year-old, I asked him what he learned. And he said, oh, Dad, we learned about Jophus and his brothers threw him into a dangerous, dangerous pit. That's what he said. And I said, well, why did they throw him in the pit, Carter? He said, because they wanted his beautiful, colorful coat. And I said, well, why do they want his coat, Carter? And he said, because he was in a dangerous pit. And they ate an animal and they wiped its blood on the coat. And I said, well, why would they do that? And he's like, because they threw him in a dangerous pit. So you can see which detail he really clung on to there, right? There was a very dangerous pit that he was thrown into. We really didn't get to the bottom of the story necessarily, but it's funny what kids remember, right, about the different things that you tell them. And if you grew up in church, you might have your favorite Bible story, right, that you liked, maybe you liked Jonah and the whale because it's, to be honest, really super gross, and maybe you were fascinated with that. Like, how in the world would he get through like the esophagus and like then survive for 3? Maybe that was your favorite. Maybe that was your favorite story. Or maybe you liked Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, right? Because we practiced walking around those walls when we were kids, right? Maybe you liked marching around the walls, and then you got to make lots of noise and stuff. And maybe that was your favorite favorite story. Or maybe David and Goliath is your favorite Bible story, right? Because you like to sing the song, and because that one little boy named David took that stone, and then he swung that stone around and 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 around. Remember that song? Just keeps going around and around in your head after a while. Maybe that was your favorite story. But maybe you didn't grow up in the church, and maybe you aren't as familiar with with Bible stories. You never learned them, or you've never heard them told necessarily, and or maybe you've got grandkids or kids, and they're coming home, after church, and they're telling you about them. Like Carter comes and tells me about the stories, and you're thinking, so there's a story in the Bible where a guy's brothers throw him into a pit and then use his coat as a tablecloth while they eat steak dinner? Like there's a story in the Bible like that? And you're thinking, that can't really be how it happened, right? Because you're getting the kids' version of the story. Well, here's the thing, because they're kids, we tell them stories, right? We tell them stories. We use pictures, and we use songs, and we use word sheets, and they've got to do little word finds, right? And find and they color in the different things and find what's different between the two pictures. But these aren't just stories. These are true accounts of real events, and they're in the Bible not just to be Bible stories, but they're there to teach us. They're there to draw us closer to God through their truths. And they're truths that we can learn from these stories. They are timeless. They're true then, and they're true now. And so to give us a better understanding of God, about God, we want to look at those stories and see what truths can they teach us. So it can't hurt to revisit them, right? It can't hurt to retell a story every once in a while, and try to discover the truth in the story. And so there's a group out there that researched what were the most popular stories from over 30 children's Bibles published between 1831 and 2013. And so they looked through all those Bibles, and they ranked how many times they listed the stories in order from the most popular, which meant it appeared in the most Bibles, to the least popular, which only appeared in a couple of the Bibles. And so they ranked them, and they had this list of the most popular stories in kids' Bibles. So we're going to, for the next 12 weeks, look at the 12 of the most popular of those stories in the Old Testament. We're going to focus on the Old Testament stories for the next 12 weeks. And so each Sunday we're going to take a practical look at a different Bible story and see what we can learn and what it can teach us. So it makes sense, I hope it makes sense, that one of the most told stories in kids' Bibles is the story of creation. And it makes sense, really, that we would start there, right? That we would start with the story of creation and see what's the story and what can we learn. And so the creation account is found in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, which, conveniently, if you took either of the Bibles from the back, it's on page 1. It should not. In fact, I can, with pretty good confidence, tell you that in your Bible, it's on page 1. So if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 1 on page 1, we're gonna take a look at the story of creation. It makes sense that we would start there. Genesis is the very first book of the Bible, and it was written by a man named Moses, which, if you've heard some other stories from the Old Testament, you might recognize his name. Moses is the deliverer and leader of the Hebrew people. They would become the future nation of Israel, and Moses was the one that rescued them from their Egyptian slavery. He's the one that writes the book of Genesis. He was raised by an Egyptian pharaoh, and that's where Moses learned to read and to write while he grew up. And so he recorded Israel's ancient history. The Hebrew people, he recorded their ancient history up until his death. He recorded that. He wrote it all down and stored it for them. And so he wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, except for the very end of Deuteronomy where he dies. He didn't write that part, obviously. That would have been someone else tossing that fact in there for you. But he wrote those 5 books to record the nation of Israel's history. And so this book, Genesis, would have been written to them kind of around the time when they were escaping from Egypt. He realized, man, I should probably start writing some of this stuff down. I should probably record this stuff and help them understand things. So the title of the book, Genesis itself means beginnings. It means origins. And so the purpose of this book is to teach the people of Israel specifically about God. Because those people, when they escaped from Egypt, out of their slavery in Egypt under the pharaohs, that group of people had a relatively small, relatively limited knowledge or understanding of God. They'd lived in Egypt for 200 years. They'd been, for over 200 years, they'd been enslaved in Egypt. And Egypt had a polytheistic culture, a polytheistic religion, which means they worshiped many gods, not just one God. And so it holds that the people of Israel growing up in that culture would have had a very small understanding of God, but would have been very familiar with the Egyptian gods, would have really understood the Egyptian gods. 200, so to put that in perspective, it was 200 years since Joseph's family, right, moved to Egypt, where Joseph was the one that the Egyptian Pharaoh favored, right? And so it's been 200 years. 200 years ago in the U.S., it was 1818. A lot has changed in 200 years, right? Our culture has a very different view of God then than it does now, right? Think about how much has shifted in just our culture's opinion and view of Christianity in the last 200 years. And how very little some people really truly know about God or understand about God. So it's been 200 years. So Moses writes this book, Genesis, in order to describe to them who exactly is God. And so Genesis is the one that describes the early history of the world, the early history of Israel, the beginnings, the origins. And it's important to understand then that the emphasis here, the emphasis of this book is to teach people about God. The emphasis of this book is to teach people about God's relationship with humanity, because the people reading this book originally in some ways were clueless. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know too much about him. They didn't understand everything that went into being who God was and his relationship and the relationship he wanted with men and how things like that worked. And so the emphasis is on God. And so before we read this creation account, realize that the emphasis that what we're going to read, the emphasis is not actually on creation. Although we're going to read the story about it, right? But the emphasis, remember this, the emphasis is not to teach us about creation. The emphasis is on God. The point is to teach us about God and who God is and his relationship with humanity. It's this story that Moses tells, this account that Moses tells, is what we would call it's a theologically selective account, meaning the point is very specific to teach us very specific things. And so it's going to focus not on all truths, not all theological truths in the Bible, but only the ones that the audience needs to understand. And what they need to understand is who is God and what is his relationship with humanity. That's what Moses is focusing on. And so what that means is not all of your questions, I'm sorry, are going to be answered when we read through this about creation, and we have to be okay with that. So no, we don't know for sure if Adam and Eve had belly buttons. And that's not the point. Right? We're not going to be able to answer that. You can make your own guess and your own educated assumption about that, and that's okay. But it's not the point of the story to find that out. The point of the story is to understand who is God and what is God's relationship with humanity? What is God's relationship with men? And so that's going to lead us to draw some differing conclusions on different points of creation, but don't forget the reason it's there. So the story, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1. And I'm going to read the story to you. Genesis chapter 1 says this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. And God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. And God called the dry ground land. And the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the great light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the waters teem, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts on the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus, the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. But by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So we believe that what we just read took place in the span of 7 literal 24-hour days. Some of the reasons we have to do with the repetition of, and there was evening and there was morning, right? And also the specific use of the word day. And each day, you'll notice, has a specific emphasis for creation, right? The first 3 days, and you'll see this in your worship guide, to kind of give you a way to organize it in your mind. But the first 3 days, God formed or created places or settings. Right? On day 1, he created light or night and day. And day 2, he created sky and sea. And then day 3 was dry land and oceans and plants. And then on the next 3 days, he filled the settings. Right? He formed, and then he filled the settings that he had created. And so he had made light and dark, and then he filled it with the sun and the moon and the stars. And then on day 5, after he had made the sky and the sea, he filled them with fish and birds. And on day 6, after he had made the land and plants on day 3, he filled it with land animals and humans. And on that last day, day 7, he rested. But remember, the reason why I'm not going to argue with you about 24-hour days is because that's not the point of this story. Right? Remember, the emphasis is on God first. Right? And then God and his relationship with humanity. And then lastly, to learn about the days of creation. Moses' audience, to be honest with you, those Israelites, those Hebrews, were very familiar with the concept of the world being created. Most ancient cultures and civilizations had explanations for how the world was created, how the world came to being. And Egypt was no different. So the details about which day was what would have been interesting and helpful for them. But that's not why he's telling them about this. Right? It's great to learn what day was what, but that's not why Moses is writing to them this story. There's some much deeper truth and much deeper significance here that we don't want to miss. And so I want to go back and look at where we see those truths. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And this is really important. The Bible starts with God. In the beginning, God. The word used in the original Hebrew language wasn't vague about this because he's writing to people who grew up in polytheism, a society with so many gods. So Moses makes it very clear the word he uses for God is not just a God. It's not just the gods that they would be familiar with. He says, no, in the beginning was Elohim. In the beginning was the one God, the only God, not just a God. In the beginning was God. It makes it very clear there is only one God. There is only one true God, not just many gods. In the beginning was the only God, the one God. Make no mistake, there's only one. In the beginning, God. And that one and only God created. In the beginning, God created. Everything up here and everything down here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and he created the earth. Heavens there, the word that you see in verse 1 is a word of perspective. It means look up. Do you see it? God made it. Whatever you see, that's the heavens. That's what God made. And earth is a perspective word too. It means look down and look around. That's the earth. God made it. He made it all. In the beginning, God created everything you see up here and everything you see down here. And truth is, everything you don't see too. God created. And really, this verse, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is a summary of the two chapters that follow. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let me tell you how it happened. Chapter 1 and chapter 2. But it lays the tone and it lays the focus, not just for the first two chapters of the Bible, but for the entire Bible and for everything that exists. God is the architect. God is the author of everything because he's where everything began. He's where everything started. He is the architect and author of everything. He created everything. And that word created is a word that is only used of what God does here. There are other words that mean form and make and shape, but this word is different. It means that he caused it to exist when it previously didn't exist. You can't make something exist. You can create with a pen and a pencil, but the pen was already there, and the paper was already there. And you might be able to draw, or you might be able to make something out of clay, but you didn't create the clay. And even if you somehow made the clay out of the water and the mud, you didn't create the water and you didn't make the mud. You shaped it and you formed it, and you could say, I created this work of art, but the truth is only God really created. Because this word created is different. This word means he caused it to exist when previously it didn't exist at all. It means that he called it into being. It means that he made everything that exists above us and around us and below us, everything out there, everything down here, everything in and on them. He made it all out of nothing. It wasn't there before he created it. Let me show you Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This verse initially was difficult for me to come to terms with. It was difficult to really, truly understand because it causes a lot of questions. Because of the wording, it causes some difficulty. But to be honest with you, as we've studied it, I've grown to love this verse. Moses writes this verse in a poetic way. He writes it almost like poetry with the intent to teach his Hebrew readers who are familiar with three realms of nature: land, ocean, and the heavens. And so he's going to try to teach them a little bit more about God and his relationship with humanity. So he says the earth was formless and empty. Meaning, in the beginning, the land that exists now, everything that you're familiar with, it wasn't there. When he says the earth, he doesn't really just mean the globe. He means land. He means everything that you're familiar with now, everything that you're standing on and interacting with now, it wasn't there. There was nothing. It was just emptiness. The earth was formless and empty. Some of your Bibles might say void, right? It was just not there. And then he says that darkness was over the surface of the deep. Remember, this is poetry. He says the depths, the deep, which is a way to describe the oceans and their understanding of how big and vast the oceans were in the world. He says the depths, which they understand to refer to the oceans, that everything that exists there now wasn't always there. In their place, he uses this word darkness. Well, that word darkness is really an idea of obscurity. You can't see it at all, and it has this connotation of ignorance too. You don't understand it, but it just wasn't there. It was obscured. Nothing was there. There was a time when what you observe now was unseen. It was non-existent. Whether it was the earth or the oceans, it just wasn't there. The earth was empty. The oceans were obscured by darkness, unseen and non-existent. And then he says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, over the surface of the waters. And this one is the hardest to interpret because of the word waters, right? You look at that word waters and say, well, where did those waters come from? And remember that he's writing with poetry. It's a poetic way to say it. And remember, he's writing to a Hebrew culture. And the Hebrew word, and this is so cool, the Hebrew word for water that you see there in verse 2, is their way, is a poetic way of saying the heavens. Everything up there, the skies and the universe. Is a poetic way of saying the heavens, because the word heavens that you see in verse 1 is a compound word, which means it was formed partly by two words, and one of those words is the word waters. And in their mythology, these ancient cultures understood that the heavens, the sky, everything out there was filled with wetness. I don't know why they thought that. I don't know why their understanding of it was like that, but they understood that when you talked about heavens and sky, it was wet. And so when they made their word for heavens, they used the word water to create that word. And so I want you to see this then. Notice when Moses is describing the creation of the sky, the creation of the atmosphere in verse 6 and 8, look at verses 6 to 8. He says, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water, right? And so God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. And then he calls the vault sky. You see that there? There's water. There's water there. It's their understanding that the heavens, the skies, everything above, their understanding was that it was synonymous with water. And so what Moses is saying here in verse 2, the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. What he's saying is that out there, everything you see, it wasn't there. In place was simply the unseen Spirit of God. Nothing was there. The only thing that was there was God and the unseen Spirit of God hovering, eager to get started with creation. And that word hovering is a really neat word because it almost means bouncing. There's an energy to it where it means that the Spirit of God was excited to get going. There's nothing here. Let's do this. Let's get creating. Let's make. I'm ready to go. And it says that he's hovering and bouncing over nothing, ready to make something. And so in the beginning, before everything else, and everything else was God. Everything you know now, the land, the depths, the heavens, any category you can think of, it wasn't there until God spoke. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, it says this. It says that by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Meaning, what we see was made out of things that were invisible, was created out of nothing. Hebrews 11:3 says the universe, everything was formed at God's command. I love this. God took a thought and he spoke it and caused it to exist. He took a thought and he spoke it and it was there. He created something from nothing. He commanded and it happened. And it happened again and again and again. This is so cool. When you read, "Let there be" in this chapter, or when you read, "And there was," or "And it was so," that's all the same word. And they're all commands and responses. They're all commands and reports. The literal meaning is this. In verse 3, he says this, and God says, "Light become." And light became. Literally how it says it. God said, "Light become," and light was. That's so cool. Or verse 6 and verse 7, right? Verse 7, and God said, "Vault, become, atmosphere, become," and atmosphere became. Dry ground, verse 9, became. Verse 11, plants became. Verse 14 and 15, lights become, and sun, moon, and stars became. Verse 24, animals became. Verse 30, man became. He took a thought, he spoke it, and it was. It existed. I love this. Every time God commanded, every time he spoke, it happened. And it happened exactly how he wanted it, exactly how he planned it, because each was good. He spoke it, it existed, and God said, "That is good. That's what I wanted. It's exactly how I wanted it." Meaning, it's complete. Exactly the way that God intended it. And if you're wondering about things created mature, were things created mature, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? If you're wondering about that, there's part of your answer. Everything was created, completed, good, exactly the way he wanted it to be. The other, right, if you look at chapter 2, verse 1, to answer that question, chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." Everything was there, working exactly the way he wanted it. He spoke it, his thought, and it existed, and it was good. If you're wondering about that created things mature, the other part is this, that the word that Moses is using, that word became, that word, light become and light was, that word that Moses is using is the exact same word that God tells Moses is his name. I am, meaning I existed, I have always existed, I am here, and I always will be. It's the same word when Moses says light was. It means that light is existing now because God said it. So used here when he commands it, it is created as though it has always existed. Fun fact for you, but the point is not creation. What does this all mean? The point is this is about God. This is about God's relationship with humanity. And we haven't gotten to the humanity part yet. Right? We haven't gotten to us yet. We're just learning about God. But what does this all mean, right? This is about God. It's not a coincidence that the very first thing Moses does is establish the existence of God. Everything starts with God. His existence looms over, it overshadows everything in a good way. When you look back and through what has happened and what exists, when you look back through it, you should see God behind it, because he overshadows everything. So the first important truth is this, that God is the focus of everything, not just of this story, but everything that follows. When God created, everything that follows should be focused on him and nothing else. God is the focus of everything. Everything through today and everything beyond. That includes you, that includes your life. God should be the focus of you and your life. God is the focus of everything because he came first. He came before everything. He existed before anything else. And so he is what we should look back to and see in light of everything. I don't know if you have a favorite artist, right, or a favorite singer who writes songs, or maybe you have a favorite author who writes books. But if you're one of those people that does a lot of reading, or if you're one of those people that does a lot of listening to music and listening to songs, you get to know the author by reading their stuff, right? It's not even necessarily about them when you read the story or when you listen to the song, although sometimes a lot of songs are about the author, right? But you get a really great idea about who that author is when you read that book, when you listen to that song, because you begin to understand, right, okay, so when they're using, think of who the author was, though. When you're reading the book, think of who the author was. And if you go to literature classes, and they do that all the time, right, remember who the author is and what she's trying to communicate when you read that book. If you listen to the song, right, sometimes you'll hear songs, you're like, I really like that song, but it helps you understand who the writer of the song was, who's performing the song, and it makes a huge difference because that song is meant to be listened to in light of who the author was. Right? When you take it out of that context and forget who the author was, the meaning changes. The same thing is true of books, right? The books are meant to be read understanding who was the author. And knowing who the author was changes things. And the same is true about creation, and everything that exists is meant to be viewed and focused as on God. Because God is the author. God is the artist. And he created everything. And so when we look at it, we need to understand who was the author, who created this, who should be the focus of this. Because this song isn't for me, it's about the person that wrote it. This book isn't for me, it's about the person that wrote it. And so this life, this world isn't about me, it's about the person that wrote it. Everything. God is the focus of everything. Everything we read in the Bible or encounter in life must be viewed in light of him, because he is the background. He is the backdrop for everything, ever. We have a tendency to view everything in light of ourselves, right? As though we were the focus, as though we are the backdrop. We view everything in light of ourselves, but it's not true. God came first, so God comes first. God is the focus. God is the focus of you. God is the focus of your life. God is the focus of this world. In Acts chapter 17, verse 24, the speaker in this verse is Paul. He's an author of a lot of the books of the New Testament, but in this case, it's describing a conversation he's having with people in the city of Athens, Greece. And he's talking to these people, and they believe in many gods, just like Moses is dealing with the people he's writing his book to. And Paul says this. He says that the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. That word there, Lord, we have a tendency. Well, that word there, Lord, is saying that God, because he made everything, he is the supreme authority. The word Lord means supreme authority. Just like you would imagine approaching a king and call him Lord, you're saying you have way more authority than I do. You have authority over me. And Paul says that because God made the world and everything in it, he is Lord. He is the supreme authority. Right? He's saying that God, because he made everything, because he is the one and only God, he is the authority. He gets to decide. And that's the second most important truth that we can take out of this, is that God is the authority over everything. He's not just the focus of everything, and that we should view everything in light of him and look back to him through everything. He's also the authority over everything. He made it, so he has ownership over it. This is actually a fundamental truth that we understand as children. Right? When we're really, really little, and maybe you didn't play with Legos, maybe you played with blocks and things like that, but when you make it, it's yours. If I make it, I get to choose what to do with it. And I've watched my sons have this argument, and it makes no sense, right? Titus is building, I think I've told you this before, but Titus will build this big tower out of blocks, right? He's the 5-year-old. He builds this big tower out of blocks, and Carter says, Dad, when we're done, can we wreck it? Can we knock it over, and I'll kick it, and can we wreck it? And I'll say, Carter, you got to ask Ty. Why? Because Ty made it, right? Titus made it, and so if he wants to wreck it, he can wreck it, and if he wants to leave it, he can leave it, right? And so Carter says, can I wreck it? And Ty says, no, I want to save it, right? And then about 5 minutes later, guess what Ty does? Knocks it over and destroys it, right? Why? Is that fair that he didn't let Carter knock it over and he gets to knock it over? Absolutely. Why? Because he made it. If you make it, you get to choose what to do with it. You get to decide what to do with it. I don't know if you've ever seen the Lego movie. Most of you probably haven't because you don't have kids. So, but there's this movie. It's called the Lego Movie, and it's about little Lego characters, and it's really fun and entertaining. And it was okay until I saw the end, and then I totally related to the movie. But I'm going to spoil it for you a little bit. And so, but the basic premise of the movie is that there's this dad who likes to make Legos, and he hates it when his kids mess them up, and so he glues them together. He glues them together because he doesn't want them to wreck it. The whole time I was watching the movie, I was like, this is weird. Until I got to the end, I was like, I get it. I totally get it, because we buy the boys Legos, and they put them all together, right? And I help them build exactly the way it's supposed to be, and then within like an hour, like pieces are missing. And I'm thinking, how do you possibly lose things this fast? Like, where did this all go? And so we've got this big tub full of Legos that don't really fit together. There is one set of Legos. This is super nerdy. There's one set of Legos in my church office right now. It's a Star Wars spaceship. They're not allowed to touch because I don't want it to get wrecked, because I made that one, and I get to decide what to do with it. So no, we're not going to play with it. We're going to leave it there and let it collect dust and look at it because it's cool. If you make it, you can break it. You can destroy it. But I made this one, right? And throughout the Bible, God's most common title is Lord, because he made everything. And because he made everything, because he is the creator, he gets to choose. He's the authority. He's the authority. That word that we see there, Lord, in Acts chapter 17:24, that is God's most common title in the Bible. Lord, meaning you are the authority. You're the supreme authority. We have a tendency, though, as humans to assume that we're the authority in life. That throughout history, man has tried to bring God or their understanding of God under their authority. We want to be the authority, and so they make temples. They make idols to manipulate God, right? Or they ignore him and claim, oh, God doesn't exist. Why? Because I don't want him to exist. I want to be the authority. Right? Or they try to manipulate him through various religious systems. We try to customize our idea of God to fit our needs and to fit our experiences. And you can try those things. You can try to ignore that God has the authority, or you can try to go around it. You can try to tell yourself you've customized God and that he fits what you think. But the truth is, because God is the creator, because God is the originator, we don't customize God. He customizes us. We don't customize God. Whether you want to believe any of that or not, it doesn't actually matter, because as creator, God is the supreme authority. Whether the creation acknowledges it or not, God is the authority. We don't worship a God who gives into our whims or our desires, who submits to our authority. We worship a God who is the ultimate authority because of his role as creator. Look at Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 12. Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 12. Should be the other way. So, but God made the earth by his power. He founded the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens by his understanding. And so our response should be, as the things created, to realize and acknowledge that God is the wise architect. God is the wise author, and we should submit to him, submit to his design as the focus, and submit to him as the authority. God, you made this. You know best. You are the author, the creator. You are the authority. Romans chapter 9, verse 20, challenges us a little bit and says, but who are you a human being, to talk back to God. Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? It's rhetorical, but the answer is no. The thing that's created never looks back at the Creator and says, why did you make me like this? That would creep me out if my Legos said that. Why'd you do this? And it shouldn't, because it was the thing created. So the response should be not, this is what I want to do, this is my life, I'm going to make the choices. The response should be, God, what should I do with your money? God, what should I do with your time? God, what should I do with your life you created for me? We are not the focus in life, and we are not the ultimate authority in life in anything, because we were created, we were made, so we submit to God. But this is also about God's relationship with humanity too. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is where we start to see that. Genesis 1, verse 26 said, God then said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. In the beginning, God created man. The creation of man is the pinnacle of the story. Everything has been building towards that moment, which is why chapter 2 goes back into more detail regarding the creation of man. Verse 4, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when God made the earth and the heavens. Verse 5, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had sprung up. He had not sent rain on the earth. There was no one to work the ground. Streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Verse 7, then God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Right? What we learn is that when God makes man, he makes him different than he makes the rest of the creation. He makes him different in both method and different in design. God still commanded man to be, and man was. But in this situation, God adds an extra step. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we learn of it. He says, man become and man became. But after he says man become, he steps in and takes it upon himself, verse 7, to handcraft Adam, to put his hands on that and mold him and then breathe into him. The method was different. It's more personal, and the design was different, right? The word image is repeated 3 times in 2 verses. There in chapter 1, verse 26, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Verse 27, so he created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. The method was different and the design was different. God made man in his image. That word is used in the Old Testament when a father has a son who is just like him. Genesis chapter 5, verse 3 is describing Adam and his kids. And Genesis 5, verse 3 says it this way. Can you go to that slide? Yeah. So when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. Right? It means facsimile. It means an accurate representation. And they use that word to describe fathers who have a son that is just like them. Today's Father's Day, so I want to take just one moment to say this, because I know that maybe not everybody had a great relationship with their dad, and not everybody had that opportunity to be able to celebrate Father's Day. And maybe today you're thinking, man, another Father's Day. Father's Day is hard, right? Let me tell you this. You look just like your dad. You were made in the image of God, and God is your father. You look just like your dad. And you have a father who made you to be in his own image. You have a father who is still watching you and still interested in you and still caring for you. And so on Father's Day, you can absolutely celebrate. You have a dad who made you just to be just like him in his own image, carefully crafting you exactly the way he wanted you. The word image there, when it talks about God making man, it means an accurate representation. The New Testament church understood it to mean this. They understood that word to mean idol. The word image, when the New Testament church uses that word, they use it as the word idol. An image, in this use, is something that makes something invisible visible, just like an idol made an invisible God visible. The Hebrews would have understood Moses to be talking about an invisible God. In this case, the invisible God. And this is the truth, that man images God. Man images God. Man makes God visible. Man was created by God to mirror his invisible attributes, who he was, to mirror his characteristics, to reflect who God is, and he put that inside man to say, I want a representative of me. I want to show who I am. I want to show who I am. And so he took who he was, just like when a dad has a son, who that dad is in that son or daughter. God took who he was and he put some of it into man because he said, I want someone to image me. I want to put part of myself into human form. And so he created man to mirror himself. Man is the representation of God on earth. And not just Adam, every single human was created in God's image. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 says that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. We are each God's handiwork. So love, creativity, authority, relationship, communication, independence, all of that inside you is a reflection of your dad, of your father, God. It's a reflection and a representation of God. That is our purpose as humans. Why are we here? To image God, to mirror God, to reflect God. Every single person images God. And what's cool is every single person images God in their own unique, special way. God didn't make mistakes when he made each of us. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every person images God. The catch is, not every person images God well. Because sin broke the mirror. Sin broke the mirror. Sin corrupted God's handiwork. And imagine the pain, imagine the disappointment when we use our creativity that God put in us and said, I want people to see this as part of me, and we use our creativity with ourselves as the focus based on our authority and not mirror God. Or the pain and frustration when we use our communication to hurt someone else. I'm sure God watches that and thinks, that's not how I made you. That's not why I made you creative. That's not why I made you independent. That's not why you were made with intellect. It's a tragedy. Sin broke the mirror. But when we place our faith in Jesus and his ability to rescue us from the corruption and consequences of sin, he then begins the process of putting back together that broken mirror and restoring that image. Colossians chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. It says that you've taken off your old self with its practices and put on the new self. And that new self is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Because of sin's damage, as Christians, we must overcome what sin has ruined in us to better and better and better reflect God, because it is the responsibility of those who understand the truths of God's existence and his authority and his creation of man. It's the responsibilities of Christians to reflect God, to image God well. Man images God. And if we have accepted that rescue from sin, it's a Christian's responsibility to image God well. So we love better with a focus on God. We are creative with a focus on God. We exercise authority with a focus on God. We communicate with a focus and submission to God, or rather we should. Because here's the thing, all people image God. Everyone images God. Everyone was created in the image of God, not just Christians. You'll notice man was created in the image of God before sin. Every single person was created in the image of God, not just Christians. And the reality is, I know people who aren't Christians whose love is more like God's than Christians. It's possible because they were made in the image of God, that my unsaved neighbor may be a better reflection of God than I am. And that's hard to hear, because we should know better. We should know better. Creation is incredible, but it's not about the plants and the animals. It's not about the sun, moon, and the stars, although it is. It's about God. God is the focus of everything that follows him into existence. And so the question we want to ask ourselves this morning, number one, is he the focus of your life? Is God the focus of your life? Or is life about you? If it is, you've got it backwards, because everything begins with God. And God, because he is the authority and architect and author, then he is the authority that we must submit to. Do you submit to God as your authority? Or do you try to manipulate God, ignore God, customize God? Submit to his authority, discover how and why he made you, and what was his design for you. And God made us with a purpose. The purpose was to bear his image and represent him well with our life, which he gave to us. So how well are you imaging God? How well are you mirroring God to the world around you? Or are you using what he made for yourself and imaging and mirroring you? If we've accepted that rescue from Christ, our responsibility is to mirror God better than the world around us. Those are the challenges for you. Is God your focus? Is God your authority? And how are you doing imaging him, representing him? That's the story of creation. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for having a plan and a design. I love that, God, you are more powerful than anything else. And even the concept and the idea that you could take a thought and just cause it to exist is sometimes hard to understand. But I love that about you, God. I love that you are the creator. You are the one and only God. And so I pray that we submit our authority to you, we submit our focus to you, and that we do the best that we can with the help of your Holy Spirit to image you and mirror you to the people around us. Help us to love well. Help us to reflect well. Help us to communicate well. Help us to do all those things that you created us to do in a way that honors you. I pray this in your name.